The rate at which we've been growing demand for animal source foods, the rate at which we've been growing that demand has compelled incredibly rapid expansion of antibiotic use, which is just, we're playing Russian roulette right now. This is just sort of crazy.
Hi, I'm Laura Riley, and this is Research Matters, a show about Cornell researchers who are tackling some of the world's toughest problems and finding solutions that make a real difference in our everyday lives. Today, we're joined by Christopher Barrett, the Stephen B. and Janice G. Ashley Professor of Applied Economics and Management in the Cornell S.C. Johnson College of Business. He's an expert in applied economics with a special focus on food and agricultural economics. Today, we will address something on everyone's minds, why food prices have risen so much in the past 20 years. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks so much for having me, Laura.
So, all right, this is just the big question. What's going on? How did we get here? And why are we all so abundantly aware of this kind of hockey stick-like, or is it a hockey stick-like rise in food prices?
Yeah, it absolutely is. We're all very aware when we go to the grocery store or restaurant that prices are just higher than they were even just a couple of years ago. What many people don't appreciate is how much they've increased over an extended period of time. The low price globally for food commodities, so not the grocery store price, but the price that's paid at wholesale level, the all-time low was December 1999. For 25 years, food prices have been rising steadily, slowly at first, and then with these big spikes, like the one we saw in 2021, 2022, as we came out of the COVID pandemic lockdowns and supply chains struggled to adjust, and then Russia invaded Ukraine and disrupted a bunch of primary supplies into global markets. A little bit of a perfect storm creates these spikes, but the underlying problem is that food demand has been increasing significantly. Populations grow, every added belly needs more food. Plus incomes grow. As people's incomes grow, they spend more on food. Not so much on the feedstock that comes from farms, much more on post-farm gate processing and preparation, but still we spend more. And
I have a question. Let me just interrupt right there because I think I've always had this idea. I know the Secretary of Ag, Earl Butz, was like, led us to believe it's our inalienable right as Americans to cheap food. That was like this thing that we believed. And for years, we had kind of the lowest percentage of our annual income spent on food of any developed country. Is that still the case, or has that changed?
Yeah, that's still the case. I mean, the global food market is very well integrated. So the high prices we face are also faced by others in other countries. We still spend, on average, Americans spend only about 10 or 12 cents out of every dollar they make on food. It's dwarfed by what we spend on housing, for example. We spend roughly 3 times as much on housing, and we spend almost double on transport. So food is important, but it's no longer the dominant thing of our lives. That's not true for really poor people elsewhere in the world, where food is the main thing their families spend their income on.
I think the average person thinks of it as a single problem. It seems like it's an interconnected web of problems. Could you just kind of break down what are the big categories that contribute to this?
Yeah, so there is one root problem, but it manifests in lots of different ways. So I like to refer to this as the food polycrisis. And by that, I mean there are a bunch of different serious problems we face that all originate from the struggles of the food system. And the best indicator is high food prices. That's the signal. So it's sort of like when your temperature rises, you have an infection, your body is struggling. There are lots of ways it manifests, but one of the cleanest, quickest ways to diagnose you have an underlying problem is that you have a fever, your temperature spikes. And food prices are sort of like that in the global food system. That is the sign that something is wrong structurally. And what's wrong is we haven't been able to increase food production at the same pace as we increase food consumption.
So demand is outstripping supply. But why? But we've been told that we could feed the world 5 times over, yada yada. I mean, it seems like, is the food in the wrong place? Are we growing the wrong things? Is it consolidation of is it that Unilever owns everything or JBS owns, what are the things that contribute to the system being broken?
There are really three big things. The first is that we've been dramatically reducing how much we spend on research and development. And so in the United States, we're spending about 30% less on agricultural R&D adjusted for inflation as we did 20 years ago. And that's true across the high-income world, by the way. China and Brazil and India have been increasing their ag R&D, but we haven't been.
So there's a difference between ag R&D and food, like Frito-Lay R&D or like the craveability of nacho cheese Doritos or something. So you're saying that's the ag research that is gumming up our productivity.
That is the single biggest thing that is causing the slowdown in growth in food supply. And the reason is really simple, that if you don't produce more of the feedstocks, because very few of us eat the commodities right as they come off the farm, if you don't produce enough of the agricultural feedstock, that simply makes it more expensive for the downstream processors. So that's one big problem, is a slowdown in R&D.
Is that just is it just like wheat, corn, soy, cotton, rice, or is it like
it's even worse on the healthiest products, the nutrient-rich products.
Specialty crops,
crops, as we tend to unfortunately refer them.
Why we call it that? It's such a bizarre.
Yeah, I mean,
the things we eat.
insensible language, fruits and vegetables and nuts. So those have gotten very little in the way of R&D, and that has been increasing more slowly than has R&D in the staple commodities in soy and corn and rice, even livestock. So lack of R&D, or in particular reduction in R&D, is perhaps the single biggest problem. Mm-hmm. But the second problem is just the natural boundaries we face in nature. There's only so much land. There's only so much water.
Is the land allocated incorrectly?
That's a great question that's subject to a lot of scholarly debate right now. The two biggest crops in the United States are corn and soy. And people would probably be shocked to realize how little of that corn and soy actually goes onto your dinner plate. Mm-hmm. Less than 10% of either U.S. corn production or U.S. soy production is going into the foods we are eating in the United States. The vast majority is feed for livestock. So quite inefficiently, it's being processed into milk and meat. There's a lot that's going into biofuels, including for soy now. And then a fair amount is exported, again, mainly for feed overseas, China above all.
Yeah, not soy this year, evidently. But
the soy is still getting sold. It's just not going at the same level, and it's not going to China right now. We'll see what happens next year. But the natural limits we face, that you've got to become more efficient in using land and using water, pose some very natural boundaries. It just gets harder to generate an extra ton of output for every dollar you're putting in as a producer, as you're moving on to less fertile land, as water is less reliably available. And then the third big challenge is climate change. Climate change is robbing us of roughly a third of the natural productivity growth we get from that R&D. I mean, keep in mind, agri-food systems are evolutionary. Pests and pathogens are constantly evolving to literally try to eat our lunch. They're trying to overcome the various methods farmers use to control them, and the ones that can are the ones that survive and reproduce. So we're constantly having to improve the genetic material in crops and livestock so that they can resist changing pests and pathogens. And we have to constantly shift to deal with changes in the underlying soils and climate. And together, this is causing real headwinds in agricultural production.
Are we seeing crop migration such that places that used to be really kind of the salad bowls or the kind of the go-tos for either animal feed or human food, is it all going to end up in like Manitoba at some point, or like what's our?
Manitoba might be a little bit of an overshoot, but you're absolutely right. If you track the centroid of production of virtually any crop in the United States, whether it's wheat or corn or beef cattle, it's been consistently moving to the west, and typically from the northwest if they're relatively warm crops like rice, and to the southwest if they're relatively temperate crops like wheat. That we're seeing climate change and water scarcity just are moving the geography of crop production. And we see that all over the world. That's not just in the United States.
So is this something that technology can be thrown at and fix, or is this just an inevitable creep northward or, in different directions? Like you think of California Central Valley or Yuma Valley or these places that have historically been where a lot of stuff gets grown.
Yeah.
Are they going to be not viable?
They'll be viable, but they're going to be viable for different crops or different varieties of crops. And that's the key part. It's the answer to your question is really both. Some of this geographic spread is inevitable. That's just a consequence of climate change as well as population change. You want to move production a little closer to your ultimate market. But a lot of this is going to be...
So you're saying just in terms of transportation costs?
Yeah,
or
exactly.
Okay.
Transportation costs are really big for food. We want to transport diamonds or we want to transport high computing chips. The cost for transport per dollar value of the product is really low, but you want to transport soybeans or milk, it's really expensive per dollar of the final consumer value. So the more you reduce transport costs, the better, especially for consumer food prices. But part of that hits the farmer too, because the farmer loses some the more the transport wedges between farmer and consumer.
Sure. More middlemen.
Exactly.
Well, so I know that this has been a kind of a mantra for a lot of people in the food industry, and it has prompted a lot of growth in controlled environment agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
Indoor vertical had this like meteoric, sexy rise, and then it kind of tanked. Kind of the whole idea of like have a farm on top of the Whole Foods so that it basically transportation costs are, nothing. Like why has that not been more successful?
It is successful in some instances. I think the key is, as with all new industries, a lot of this is washing out the bad ideas or the relatively poor performers, and those with good ideas who are figuring out how to do this efficiently and profitably, they're doing pretty well. And the prospects for controlled environment agriculture, I think, at 10-year horizon are actually quite bright. The key here is energy costs. Transport costs are the advantage of vertical farming. The downside is energy costs. So keep in mind, how does farming work? You get free solar power. Plants are just big solar arrays, right? Photosynthesis is converting solar energy into chemical energy.
Free, right?
And it's free.
Yeah.
And it's really hard for a firm to top that price for their energy. But as the costs of especially solar, but also wind has come down dramatically, suddenly it's not inconceivable that you can profitably generate high quality, high value products. You're never going to grow wheat and corn in factories inside cities. That's just not going to be viable. But growing high quality fruits and vegetables, absolutely already viable in some places. A Cornell alum, one of my former undergraduate advisees, he and his brother started a small company in India doing exactly this. They were making money within 3 years. They've got franchises in multiple cities across Asia now. But the key is a focus on really high quality planting material, very energy efficient production, and high value products. So you're not trying to grow wheat. You're growing blueberries. You're growing really high quality kale for upscale markets and restaurants.
All right. So I want to talk a teeny bit about kind of policy, regulatory frame, the legislation, or even consolidation. So we saw in the Biden administration, when he got dinged for high food prices, he blamed consolidation, the meat companies, the big four, big five.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing that in the Trump administration too. So how much, like if you go to the freezer aisle, you see 40 different flavors of ice cream, kinds of brands of ice cream. And then you step back and you realize like most of them are owned by Unilever, right? So how does consolidation in the food industry, like, is there price fixing? Is there anything nefarious going on? Or how does that contribute to food prices?
Oh, it definitely contributes both to higher food prices for you and me when we go to the grocery store and to lower prices for producers who are selling to those middlemen because they just don't have many other prospective buyers for their eggs, for their wheat, for their cattle. But this is almost surely not the main driver of why we've seen steadily increasing food prices. For one thing, consolidation, especially in the animal agriculture side, in eggs and poultry and cattle, has been significant for a couple of decades now. That's not something
So it's
new.
not new.
Depending upon whose numbers you like, it's perhaps gotten a little bit worse, but that can't possibly account for the 25% increase in inflation-adjusted grocery prices we've seen over the last 20 years. That's just, there's no way of reconciling those numbers. The underlying problems originate in this fundamental supply growth, demand growth imbalance. Food demand is just growing faster than supply is. And if we don't do something about that, which requires using soils and water much more productively than we do right now, and more climate resistant cultivars, ones that can handle a heat wave or handle submergence in the case of rice for longer periods, then we're not going to keep pace. And that fever, as I was referring to earlier, will continue to rage. We'll continue to see high food prices, and people suffer from that.
So we've seen a lot of growth or a lot of promise in technology and some pushback. So we've seen, the rise of plant-based meat and cultivated meat and kind of fermentation technologies. And there's a lot of things that have been promised as kind of the next big thing that are going to obviate the need to eat animals or to, have animal dairy or whatever. Are we barking up the wrong tree there, or is that something that eventually will pay off?
So I think often that debate is miscast. It's not that alternative proteins are going to replace animal agriculture. I think that's a wildly naive vision of the food system. We don't need it to, and frankly, most of us wouldn't want it to. There are an awful lot of people whose livelihoods depend fundamentally on producing and processing livestock. That's great. We need to manage the environmental side effects of livestock production a little better than we do now. There's progress there. The question is, how are we going to absorb the future food demand growth that's coming, given we're butting right up against the planetary boundaries posed by water and to a lesser degree land, but also chemicals? I mean, one of the great threats related to livestock agriculture is antimicrobial resistance. We use antibiotics on not just cattle and poultry, but aquaculture. Those farm salmon people so like in the grocery store, there's a ton of antibiotic going into those ponds. And it's much less well controlled than antibiotics used in our medical system for treating human health concerns.
So are you saying it should be as a kind of a prophylaxis or some kind of automatic strategy in some of these contexts? We should rethink that? Or should humans use less antibiotics? Like, what's the fix?
So I'm not an MD, so I won't pontificate on using antibiotics in humans, but the rate at which we've been growing demand for animal source foods, especially aquaculture, the fastest subsector in agri-food systems, the rate at which we've been growing that demand has compelled incredibly rapid expansion of antibiotic use, which is just, we're playing Russian roulette right now. This is just sort of crazy. So part of the solution of alternative proteins is being able to absorb much of that growth in a much cleaner system that doesn't require antibiotics. We've got to get the cost down. There's lots of really interesting, potentially quite important research going on about better growth media and better scaffolding and all that sort of technical stuff. But the key here is how are we going to absorb all the demand for animal source foods going forward without expanding the present footprint of our animal agriculture system? Maintain it. We need it. It does a lot of good in many ways, including helping regulate some environments. I work in a lot of rangelands around the world where cattle and goats and camels are really important to the ecological regulation. But the systems we use right now, the most intensive ones, especially heavy reliance on antibiotics, just run some risks. And we need to manage methane emissions much better from cattle because that's contributing significantly to global warming. But those are fixable. Again, that's where research comes in.
Europe has products now that are legal that minimize methane emissions.
Exactly.
Why have we not gotten there? What's the holdup on some of those kinds of feed amendments for cattle?
Yeah, mainly it's cost. So we are getting there. So keep in mind that most European livestock producers are dramatically smaller scale than we are.
Absolutely.
So relative to an American dairy that is running 1,500 cattle, You've got Dutch and Belgian dairies that are running 50 cattle. So if they incur an extra $5 a year in cost for feed supplements, they can absorb that, especially with the subsidies they get from the EU. Apply that same per cow extra cost to a U.S. producer without a U.S. subsidy that's anywhere equivalent to that, you're just going to have farmers going out of business, which then becomes self-defeating. Mm-hmm. So the key here is continued progress on bringing down the unit costs of those supplements that reduce methane emissions. Yeah. And we're making progress there. It's just we have to be patient. I think a lot of the problems with alternative proteins and controlled environment agriculture and methane emission reducing feed supplements for livestock is impatience. It's sort of a venture capital culture of we're going to put money in today and we expect a high return within 48 months or 24 months.
So, but that's cost, right? I mean, yeah. I guess another question then is our farm subsidy system wrong-headed? I mean, are we subsidizing the wrong things? Should we be putting more towards, either prevent or crop insurance or all these kinds of things for controlled environment ag or, alternative protein sources or like, are our thoughts antiquated on subsidy?
Yes. Just the politics are hard. So roughly speaking,
it's a big lobby, right?
Yeah. Roughly speaking, the Farm Bill, leave out the nutrition part, leave out SNAP, has three big components to it. Crop insurance is the biggest one. And the U.S. subsidizes crop insurance like 65% of the premium is paid by the government for farmers. And it doesn't cover all crops. It mainly covers the big commercial crops, main row crops. And then you've got direct payments to farmers, and you've got conservation programs. So essentially land set-asides, pay farmers not to cultivate lands, largely to protect wetlands and groundwater. That's a very strange way of allocating funding. And this is, again, as we've cut R&D by about 30%. So the challenge here is how do we reallocate towards R&D and allocate towards conservation programs that really work. There's a bit of a mixed bag in how our current conservation programs work. And how do we promote more cultivation that is sustainable and generates healthy food? We get relatively little subsidy for specialty crop producers. Fruits and vegetables and nuts producers get a trivial share of what the federal government spends in the U.S. This isn't radically different from Europe either. This is a high-income country problem where we have these big subsidies that have been largely locked in, trapped on current producers using old technologies because they have influence.
So it's about legislators, having,
and
being strongly urged to continue these practices.
Exactly. And the great fear, frankly, is that China follows in our path. China now has the largest farm subsidies of any country on earth, which surprises lots of people because China is still a middle-income country. It's not rich by any standard. China also has by far the largest R&D budget.
How long can seeds, right? Aren't they investing a huge amount in
they are investing in everything. But how long should be worrying? How long can they sustain both R&D expenditures and farm subsidies? We used to do both. As we started to hit budget issues, legislatures caved in to provide the short-term payouts farmers insisted on, and they've kept cutting R&D, which winds up hurting us in the medium to long term. It hurts those farmers, especially those who can't adapt to climate change fast enough, but it especially hurts consumers because it means that food prices keep inching up over time as supply growth can't keep pace with demand growth. China is going to face that same sort of fiscal challenge in the coming decade. I was just in China last month, and it's interesting how much they are paying attention to what do we do to support farmers.
Well, they also don't have enough land to be food self-sufficient. So that's a huge thing for China. And Xi has been talking about that for several years, and we should all pay attention.
And that's why they invest so heavily in R&D, because they recognize how vulnerable they are in the present global environment. If people just turn off the exports to them voluntarily, then that's a national security issue for the Chinese. So they are very concerned about R&D. But at some point, they do have to maintain a fiscally sustainable budget. And will they really be able to?
Well, they haven't done it in real estate, so
Yeah,
we'll
but
see. We'll see what happens, right?
But can they roll back the subsidies and maintain the R&D? Because if they don't, that's only going to aggravate this underlying structural problem of we are seeing a slowdown in the rate of what we economists call total factor productivity growth, roughly output per unit input. So are we getting more bang for our buck out of the natural resources we use? And that's been slowing steadily as R&D investments have declined.
All right. We've already gone, I could go on this stuff. It's so fascinating to me, but I want to bring it back to consumers. So, we've got 1 billion people malnourished, 1 billion people obese, maybe a little bit less because of GLP-1s, that may be inching down a T. Yeah, right. But what should consumers be doing to eat healthfully, but also kind of minimize the cost, or how can they be more thoughtful about the decisions that they make?
That's a real challenge because we make so many food choices every day. It's just cognitive overload to try to think through every single choice. Let's see. They just asked me, do I want potato salad with that, or macaroni salad with that, or a green salad with that, or something else? And I have to think through every one of those choices. Green salad, do you put dressing on it? If so, what's in the dressing? Just the number of component questions is so large. It's relatively unlikely any of us, even the most well-informed consumer, is ever going to really process that information well. So the crucial thing here is for us to work through regulatory mechanisms to get food prices, which we know we all respond to. You look at a menu and you're going to choose between two things that look equally attractive to you. You're going to choose the lower cost one more often than not. So get the costs aligned with the healthfulness. And that's, again, part of why it's so important to invest in specialty crops research. The relative cost of fruits and vegetables and nuts has gone up faster than the cost of all the ingredients you and I consume that aren't particularly healthy for us. And a lot of that.
Speak for yourself. I am a paragon of virtue.
I can tell, and I'm very impressed.
No, totally not.
Until we give the food manufacturers and the restaurants a profitable means of putting really healthy food in front of us, we're going to always struggle to try to convince consumers to be more virtuous than they're capable of. I mean, all of us are just going to struggle with that. So the trick is to help the middlemen that sit between farmers. Well, help them to do good while they do well. And a lot of that is just how do we set up the R&D so that they can get lower cost healthy ingredients? How do we set up the regulatory guardrails so that they can't ultra process things, they can't add in lots of stuff that is just likely bad for us, even though it might make the food taste a little better or look a little more appealing. It's really a matter of getting the carrots and sticks in place for all those intermediaries so that the cheaper diet is the healthier diet. And until we do that, we'll continue to battle the health epidemic that results from our dietary choices.
All right. One final question. Do you have a book recommendation for folks who want to read a little bit more about food pricing and the food system writ large?
If you're interested in just the underlying economics of the entire food system writ large, there's a wonderful undergraduate textbook, which sounds intimidating, but it's very well written.
This may be a hard sell, but okay.
But there is a great book by Will Masters, who's at Tufts University, and Amelia Finneret, who's at Allegheny College, called Food Economics. And it will walk you through everything from labeling to farm bill programs to crop insurance to how people respond to prices, talk about the affordability of diets. It's really a terrific book that walks you through it all.
Yeah. All right. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming in today. This has been wonderful. You've been listening to Research Matters from Cornell University. If you like this episode, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and share it with a friend who loves facts as much as you do. Thanks for listening. And remember, when research meets purpose, we move closer to a healthier, fairer world.